Okay, thank you. Welcome to the MORTEXVAR conference, and thank you for your interest and time. This conference is one of the main outcomes of the earlier Egyptian mortuary text variability project funded by the Madrid region government through its Atracción de Talento program. The project is based at the University of Alcalá near Madrid. The MORTEXVAR project focuses on the general operative concept of variability in the pyramid text and the coffin texts and other related texts and materials. You may have a quick look at the project at the website mortexvar.com and all the related news on Facebook. The MORTEXVAR conference intends to reflect on a preprint collective volume which includes 17 contributions about different aspects of variability as a major criterion to retrieve information from the sources. This criterion articulates in 3 leads to inspire a structure for the collective volume. The first lead is individuals. Study cases that are particularly telling not only about their individuality, but about how and why they are exceptional within the bigger picture. The second lead is groups. Study cases of groups that may constitute substreams within mainstream traditions or minor streams outside the mainstream. The third lead is tracers, elements of variability in the mainstream that allow us to trace change, innovation, or disparity processes, including errors and corrections. The aim of the 3 leads is to provide a holistic picture to refine our understanding of the connections between what are usually seen as elements of a system and the system itself, and to ultimately review those 2 concepts, element and system, which are critical to the Western conceptual frame. The relation between a system and its parts deserves detailed investigation, as Nick Enfield has recently stressed. I have highlighted some sentences I think are particularly telling. Especially, we need to understand the link between the parts and the higher level systems they belong to. All facts about items need to be linked to facts about systems. In this book, we intend to explore how these 3 qualitatively different kinds of parts, individuals, groups, and tracers, may act in different manners within a system and with the system itself. The threefold approach shapes the 3 conference sessions. Today's sessions on the topic individuals will be chaired by Jurjana Beek, and we'll start with Julia Hamilton's analysis of the peculiar case of Nikawi-Sezi Sakaratum secondary epigraphy. This material informs us about the rituals and the ontological status of the owner during the second half of the 6th dynasty. The use of different communication codes, hieroglyphic, semi-hieratic, and representational, and the comparison of this secondary epigraphy with other related documents, the so-called letters to the dead, enlightens us about the intimate tie between the material and conceptual dimensions of communication in ancient Egypt. Veronika Dulikova and Maria Petarkova-Hlouchova will publish Setip's wooden coffin from 6th dynasty Abusir with its related burial equipment in the MORTEXVAR book. In their study of the coffin, Veronika and Maria used comparative materials within the coffin's social and historical context. Angela MacDonald will display different expressive variations in the writing signs and their directionality, as well as text formats of the so-called letters to the dead. Angela will analyze this material in the context of the related corpus of the coffin text to discuss the function of the way these texts materialized. Jean-Pierre Pesnik, which finally cannot attend today, describes the singular process of reinterpretation of a divine name, the Abadian jackal Genti Mentiu, as the Auxilian epithet genti e mentiu, because of metonymy. For the deceased, deified king is only natural to preside over the place of permanence, men, which is in the West, Yemen. Jean-Pierre's approach provides evidence from the beginning of the dynastic period through the Middle Kingdom. Cesar Guerra Mendez and myself gathered all the spellings for the name Osiris in the pyramid text and coffin text to analyze them in context and weigh their conceptual implications, especially on the status of the deceased and the incorporation of Osiris into the solar circuits in the mortuary sphere, as well as the mechanics of writing that are involved. Tomorrow's session on the topic roots will be chaired by Rune Njord, and we start with Seria Yamazaki's proposal that the royal object ritual, an important funerary ritual deeply connected to Osirification, was performed strategically in the Middle Kingdom. Seria will tackle the hypothesis with the depictions of objects offered during this ritual, which are contained in the object friezes on early Middle Kingdom coffins, and which were later retrieved from late Middle Kingdom tombs as real grave goods. Juan Carlos Moreno Garcia will scan the pyramid text and coffin text to retrieve variations of social groups, such as the demiu and nutiu. The comparison between both corpora will make it possible to calibrate the importance of social changes in the context of the archaeological and epigraphical record, and to analyze to what extent they correspond to actual social dynamics visible in the material evidence too. Cristel Alvarez will show that some sequences in the pyramid of Kakare-Ibi, 8th dynasty Saqqara, diverge significantly from older ones and present close connections with certain coffin texts. Cristel will compare several sequences of spells and provide a philological analysis of some unparalleled spells occurring in the pyramid of Ibi, so to illustrate the notion of variability through the ordering and compiling of a selection of spells. Anne Landborg will discuss a group of coffin text transformation spells which target an inanimate, the Heperu Mchal, coffin text 223, 288, and 988. Although wind or breath are connected to Shu, and the spell contains historiole related to him, the title doesn't say becoming Shu, and there is no identification with the god in the spell, nor is there an identification with wind. Anne's point is that, contrarily to the other transformation spells, they do not identify the deceased with a being that is associated with some desirable property, but they assign properties to the deceased directly and without intermediaries. Yannick Wichmann revisits the famous group of Vagnetsbrugge, which is attested from the Middle Kingdom text through Roman times. Yannick makes the point that coffin text 474, with the later spin-off Book of the Dead 153a, and coffin text 307, 308, later merged into Book of the Dead 153b, might have a particular status within the coffin text group, coffin text 473 through 481. Yannick will also discuss the question of the existence of a common text for these spells, the possible relations between their internal parts, and the possible connection of these spells with the royal fishing and fowling prototypical background. Friday's session on tracers will be chaired by Andreas Tauder, and we'll start with Jorge Grottenhuis, in principle, maybe we change the schedule, study of the spellings for the first-person stative ending in the coffin text and related material. Jorge demonstrates that the different endings not only respond to regional variation, but also to textual context, graphical context, spatial context, and temporal context. Gersan Edima gathers evidence that funerary wooden models, which were typical from elite burial equipment from the 6th dynasty through the reign of Senwosret III, occupied a central place in religious thought between the end of the Old Kingdom and the second half of the Middle Kingdom. Gersan shows how the models embody the new concepts related to the deceased and his status in the afterlife, themes that are at the heart of contemporary funerary literature. Victoria Almansa Villatoro will analyze linguistic variation in Old Kingdom personal correspondence that indicate sender's intention, hierarchy, and context prestige. Through her study, Vicky will present evidence of archaisms, pyramid text features, and innovations, Middle Egyptian features, which result in questioning Old Egyptian as an unitarian linguistic stage and the possible connection between hierarchy and different linguistic expressions. Dina Serova showcases graphemic, linguistic, and textual variation under the light of intertextualization processes through registered choices made by the scribes as materialized in the two main versions of Coffin Text 335, one long with metatext, the other one short without metatext. Dina will publish Coffin Text 335 Witness on the sarcophagus of Ipi from Thebantum 315, which is a short version of the spell. Elizabeth Cook will trace the relationship between grave goods and their representations in the coffin's object friezes that spans from co-occurrence to substitution. Lisa's ultimate question is what factor or factors make possible one item be replaced by its representation. The procedure that we follow, book plus conference, contrasts with the usual conference plus proceedings volume academic standard and permits to provide feedback to an already mature work with which all the contributors are familiar. This has the advantage of allowing more precise and improvised feedback on the contributions, and not less and importantly, on the three leads proposed to inspire a structure of the collective work produced around the operative concept variability. The resulting book and conference are expected to offer a showcase covering fields of study that include archaeology, history, philology, linguistics, visual arts, and multidisciplinary approaches. The conference will proceed in 3 sessions, today, tomorrow, and on Friday. During the afternoon, 2 to 5 Central European time. Each session will consist of 5 to 6 50-minute talks, a 15-minute break, and about 19-minute discussion among speakers, plus the questions from the audience chat. The sessions will be recorded and made available on the MORTEXVAR YouTube channel after the conference. To the speakers, I am in debt with you all for your interest and enthusiasm in the MORTEXVAR project, for happily expose yourselves to this particular format, book draft, and then the conference, for your time and excellent contributions. To Suzy Beck, Rune Njord, and Andreas Stauder, thank you very much for finding the time in your packed agendas to chair the sessions. I appreciate your collaboration deeply. Also, I want to thank the audience for attending the conference and for registering, a bothering intermediate step, I know that, but helped us to keep the conference safe. Finally, the conference would have been impossible without the help and expertise of Maria Ribes Lafoz and Ernesto Graf. Thank you a trillion. Today's session will be chaired by Zuzana Beck from the University of Edinburgh. Suzy, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Carlos, for the introduction, and also thank you for organizing this highly exciting Congress. I am sure that we will have very lively discussion after the talks. So yeah, let's start today's session. Our first speaker will be Julia Hamilton, Macquarie University, Sydney, with the presentation entitled Secondary Epigraphy and Interaction with Transfigured Dead, the Case of Nikau Izezi Sakara. So Julia, the floor is yours. Yeah, and we can see your presentation. So
I'll just unmute myself. Thank you so much. What a kind introduction from both you, Carlos, and also Jordana. It's really nice to join you here from Sydney, where it has now gone 10:15 p.m. So I'm hoping I make it to the end of discussion. I'm really committed today. I'll try to be committed also on Thursday and Friday. So without further ado, since we only have 15 minutes, I just wanted to make my PowerPoint work. There we go. I just wanted to begin very briefly with what we call an acknowledgement of country in Australia. So the place where I'll be sharing my research with you this evening at Macquarie University is built on the land of the Darug Nation. And I want to offer my respect to the people of this land here that Macquarie stands on, the Wallumattagal clan, who are the custodians of this land and also its original storytellers, and they have been for thousands of years, and it feels appropriate to offer this with you since we're such an international audience. In this paper, I will discuss a small subset of the epigraphic activity in the chapel belonging to a high official named Nikau Izezi. More generally, I want to reflect on the theme of this conference through elevating secondary epigraphy to sit alongside other well-attested and contemporaneous traditions of interacting with the transfigured dead, and as a response to a sacred, inscribed, and decorated environment. The Sakara Plateau is saturated with graffiti. This is something I've spoken about a lot in the last few years, so I apologize for anyone who's attended a talk I've given during lockdown about graffiti. Due to the lack of a global survey for Old Kingdom Sakara, though, it's actually quite difficult to succinctly demonstrate or quantify this material. Briefly, many marks on these ancient surfaces simply do not easily fit into existing Egyptological categories for ancient writing. And indeed, many graffiti occupy, both figuratively and also literally, the space between text and image. In the case of New Kingdom graffiti and New Kingdom graffiti from Sakara, the place that I'll largely be drawing my material from, productions are often prefaced by a formula. So this is the visit made by a scribe, and this narrates a personal event of someone visiting a tomb or a monument. But this expression, anything like it, is not found among Old Kingdom compositions. Yet, clearly, such graffiti evince people visiting tombs, and they're also intimately connected to the ongoing use of their cemeteries. Whereas some tombs may not preserve many or any indications of textual graffiti, and this is a term that I think is not wholly suitable for this material, but anyway, we'll go with it. They frequently carry other forms of material intervention. So this is something I've also been interested in the last few years. These range from the negative in the form of erasures, but also modifications to existing or earlier inscriptions, not all of which are graffiti in a narrow sense. Just one example that I show here on the slide here, a modification of the cartouche of Pepi I changed from Nefersahor to Mary Ray in the Chapel of Newman, so just to the east of Nikau Izezi, and I'll get to him in a little bit. And this modification was both carved and then also in paint. The tools used to make the inscriptions that I'll be showing today varied, and the haptics and embodied practice of graffiti making in the Old Kingdom, I believe, is certainly deserving of a more sustained study. I include here an artist's reconstruction produced from a study of New Kingdom hieratic graffiti, or dipinti, I should say, in Dahshur by Hanna Navratilova. For many of these Old Kingdom inscriptions, however, we need to dispense entirely with this image of a scribe with a scribal palette, and in fact put into the hands of these authors a copper chisel or a chip of limestone, so a sharp thing at hand. Most of these inscriptions are scratched or incised, and in fact very few are painted. The tool and the surface, as well as the experience of the writer in working on limestone, quite specifically, very much influences the character of graffiti that occurs in these tombs. So painted secondary inscriptions, which are also called dipinti, are much more frequent in the New Kingdom, and they're attested only rarely on Old Kingdom monuments, which is why I wanted to show material from Nikau Azezi today. Most painted inscriptions that date to the Old Kingdom are in fact not secondary at all, and this includes the painted builders inscriptions, sometimes also referred to as bow graffiti. These are not secondary, they're added to a monument in the process of construction. They're very much tied to a language of construction that is, yes, connected to this process of building monuments, mostly pyramids and Saqqara. Other painted, sorry, I've lost my lost my place. Here we go. Why I include them, and I think they're very interesting as comparative material, though, is that they're important for their prosopographic details. And also for studying orthography of Old Kingdom personal names. And there are some really interesting overlaps in orthographies, but between scratched and incised graffiti and these painted inscriptions, particularly in titles such as Khemka or the Sa bird, both of which are often written fully hieratic, and also the F and Nefer signs, which sometimes have a semi-hieratic quality. And sometimes in the scratch inscriptions, they're written with 2 strokes across the windpipe of the Nefer, for example, which you also see in builders' inscriptions. The global study of hieratic, which is being undertaken by the AKU project at Mines, will improve the repertoire for old hieratic paleography. But I also think that localized paleographic studies of graffiti remain necessary, especially if potential exists to connect inscriptions to the hands of particular individuals within the same monument, but also across a group of monuments or across the Saqqara Plateau. So now we get to Nikau Azezi's tomb. I've tried to point it out on this map here. I hope some of you might have seen it if you've visited Saqqara. It was first cleared in the 1980s. So there was a report in 1987 about the tomb, and then it was not published until the 2000s. And in fact, it was published by my new colleagues here at the Australian Centre of Egyptology in the year 2000. But there's a lot of work to still do here. And it was pointed out in a number of reviews of this work that, in fact, the quality of this tomb to have many added inscriptions and also graffiti was not discussed so extensively in the volume. So there's real potential to add something new in this contribution, which I do promise to deliver to Carlos very soon. So very, very briefly, who was Nikau Azezi? In fact, we know a little bit about Nikau Azezi from outside his tomb, which is really rare for officials buried in Saqqara. So there are 4 builders' inscriptions from the blocks of the Pyramid of Pepi I at South Saqqara, so quite a way away from the Teti Pyramid Cemetery, at least by walking. And that include his name and title, at that stage, sole companion. There's also a sole companion Nikau Azezi named in a temple degree from the reign of Teti, which is now in the British Museum. And again, among a group of officials in the reliefs of the Unis Causeway. So we have 3 different attestations of an official named Nikau Azezi with the same titles. And then finally, we have Nikau Azezi, a quite rare name, only known from here in Saqqara, as far as we know, buried in the Teti Pyramid Cemetery, just to the north of Kargennis Chapel, finally with titles including Overseer of all works of the king. And I just wanted to very briefly point out, although I don't have as much time as I'd like to spend on this, but the name, Nikau Azezi's name is actually written in these inscriptions outside of his tomb in a more profane manner, where the Ka part of the name is written with the K basket and not with the Ka symbol. So I would argue that this underscores the importance of examining the orthographic variants of personal names according to their inscriptional setting. And maybe somebody can throw some questions at me about that later. So now turning to the secondary epigraphy, it's been proposed that Nikau Azezi probably died during the reign of Pepi I, and the interior decoration of his tomb appears to have been hastily finished. So what's interesting is that on the east wall of room 1, we have this scene in the marshes with Nikau Azezi, which has been finished in paint. So we have the addition of a figure here, messy, fully in paint, not carved. And then underneath, a really rare, fully painted hieroglyphic inscription that records the date of Nikau Azezi's burial. There are very few inscriptions of this type from the Old Kingdom. And the only comparable one, there's one at Abu Sir and another at Giza in the tomb of Queen Meresankhh III. So for Nikau Azezi, it just reads 11th count, 1st month of Akhet, day 20, burial in the necropolis of the hereditary prince, the treasure of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Nikau Azezi. And here the name is fully written with the ka and also with this embodied by a human grapheme of a seated noble man. Also in the tomb, and actually in the same room, we have another type of secondary epigraphy that I want to spend a little more time on because I think it's very interesting for thinking about language at this time in the Old Kingdom. So the paint editions probably date to a period quite close to when Nikau Azezi was buried. These scratched inscriptions might date later. And we have one name in particular, Merit Itef, that occurs 3 times, all in the same area, moving here between room 1 through to room 3, which is where there is an offering place. I'm just conscious of time, so I'll try to stick to my notes. All of the graffiti occur approximately 1.5 to 1.7 meters from the ground, and they're in close proximity to each other. I don't think they're all made in the same visit. I think they might be produced in successive visits. What's really interesting about this name and in these graffiti is that the mare sign, the mare part of the name, Yannis Gordon has suggested that the mare sign could be used to sort of trace as a way of tracing dating of inscriptions that include this sign, specifically in the orientation. But what we have here in this inscription is the mare sign oriented in 3 completely different ways, depending on the direction of its reading. So at least for this inscriptional context, and graffiti don't always follow these patterns of orientation, I think this might not work. So that's one interesting point. The second is that it mixes a sort of semi-hieratic and fully hieratic style, particularly with the F's and the T's. And there seems to also be, the author sort of has a difficulty carving the R sign, which might also reflect the difficulty of carving into limestone, the author being more practiced. If the author is Meir Itef, the author is perhaps more practiced writing in a different medium and not carving into limestone. So those are just a few things that we can observe just about this single name. Basically a single name within one monument might tell us a world about how people are writing at this time. So another question is, who is Merit Itef? He's not named anywhere else in Nikau Azezi's tomb. So this is also an interesting quality of graffiti, is that it spans rapidly the possible extended household for the people using this cult place. I'm just going to talk about he as the author and this being Merit Itef, but I'm making a bunch of assumptions here. Merit Itef seems to add the name always to figures that are participating in offering scenes. This does not necessarily mean that he was a car servant, but I think we should entertain the possibility that he was actually part of the wider extended household whose job it was to nourish the car of Nikau Azezi in perpetuity. And I think this is where we can sort of link graffiti to this type of graffiti to other forms of interacting with the dead, and establishing a connection generally between a named individual and their wider community, which includes the dead, was paramount in commemorative spaces. This is evinced in so many different ways through inscribed and votive offerings. And I really do think often of the Kabet Hawa, these inscribed dedicatory bowls, where names are an important part of this type of offering, but also other types of inscriptions, not just the letters of the dead, but also agreements with the dependents in legalistic contexts that are also sometimes quite formally placed into a term where the name is also quite important. It's notable that authors of these graffiti, like Merit Itef, incise their names very close to human figures. It's not just anywhere, and it's not just about looking for space. It's about finding space next to human figures, performing offering gestures, and that often the signs, but not always, are oriented into a correct directional reading, into the face or into the torso of the person performing that role. And I've argued elsewhere, and I would like to argue again in this paper, that I think this means that these figures are operating at a lexical level in the same way as a name embodied by a human grapheme, as we saw in the painted inscription. And so I'll start drawing my points to a close now. It's difficult, I think, to establish whether these inscriptions, particularly the scratched graffiti, are added significantly later in a tomb's history, or whether they were anticipated as part of the original planned use of the tomb and the stretch of time between death and actual burial. The emphasis on planned and things being tightly regulated, I think the graffiti pushes back against this idea. And I think this might distort how ancient Egyptians used and reused reused their funerary monuments and the role that graffiti could have played in this. There are very strong indications just in this environment, in the Teti pyramid cemetery, that some graffiti were the product of successive repeated visits. So people continuously coming back to this place to perform these duties, adding graffiti as part of this process. I think these inscriptions are material traces of visiting the tomb, using graffiti as a medium to integrate their authors into the social world of the tomb owner, while also harnessing the monumental presence of the chapel to memorialize their name. So I think Nico Azezi makes an ideal case study for tracing an official whose duties spanned the breadth of the Saqqara Plateau and beyond, and also he was buried locally, whereas dependents and perhaps members of his extended household completed and also added to his monument in order to associate their names and memory with his. I think location-specific evaluations of graffiti and so-called secondary additions in their material and social environment, their context and their co-text, enriches our understanding of how tombs were used and reused in ancient Egypt, and the salience of a tomb space through time can be traced through graffiti and other like inscriptions. And a final observation is that not only do graffiti offer a wealth of onomastic data, they also might evince emic ideas about personal names and how they should be ideally communicated in writing, that their orthographies could be situationally determined. Thank you. I hope I'm mostly on time, Zsuzsanna.
Yeah, you are perfectly on time. Thank you very much. Also for being on time, and also for this excellent presentation. There will be a lot to discuss, so I hope
Super,
it won't be
too
too late.
Sharing.
Too late for you. So yeah, thank you very much again. And let's continue with the presentation of Veronika Dulikova and Marie Kruchova-Peterkova from the Charles University Prague. Decorated coffin of King's Ornament Setib, buried at Abu Sir. So the floor is yours, and I see your presentation. So yeah, we are looking forward to it. But I can't hear you if you are already talking. I can't hear you.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. First of all, we would like to express our thanks to Carlos, who invited us to this remarkable coffin project. Today, we would like to present to you a recently found 6th dynasty wooden coffin, which originated from the excavation of the Czech Institute of Egyptology, Charles University. Since 6th dynasty coffins at Abu Sir usually decayed or were largely disturbed by ancient thieves, the as yet unpublished decorated coffin of Seti represents a unique find from this cemetery. The coffin was discovered during the excavation of Mastaba IS 79 during the 2015 autumn season at Abu Sir South. The mastaba lies on the central hillock, where high-ranking dignitaries of the 5th and 6th dynasties were buried, including Vizier Kar and his son Judge Inti. The superstructure of the mastaba was largely destroyed. No count structures were detected here. Shaft 14 contained a female burial in which this wooden coffin was found. Setib's burial chamber had been only partially disturbed by ancient thieves, and so almost all her burial equipment, including jewels made of faience, copper, and golden foils, have been preserved. The body of middle-aged A female was originally placed in an outstretched position with hand on the left side. Several cakes, several cakes probably made of mud mixed with sand placed around the deceased. Such a burial equipment has a parallel with the burial of Vizier Ptaszewski from Giza dated to the reign of Pepi II. Travertine headdress with an inscription and two travertine vessels with lids were put close her head. One of vessels bear an incised inscription per nisut. The coffin has a standard late 6th dynasty shape and decoration style. The rectangular box with a flat lid bears a horizontal band of text around exterior perimeter and a pair of Horus eyes on the east wall. A horizontal band of text around the exterior perimeter was situated on the east, west and north walls. An inscription on the east wall starts at the head end. An offering which the king gives, and Osiris Gentimentiu, the lord of Abydos, may she has a beautiful burial in the necropolis in the western desert. May she ascend to the great God in pure places of the heaven. The king's ornament honored before the great God, said Eve. An inscription on the exterior west wall was completely destroyed. An inscription on the interior west wall starts at the head end. An offering which the king gives, and Anubis, who upon his hill, who is in embalming place, the lord of the sacred land, who presides over the divine booth. May she walk on beautiful journeys of the west, being accompanied by her cows, the king's ornament honored before the great God, said Eve. An inscription on the north wall says, an offering which the king gives, bringing of ointment for her in the residence for the king's ornament, said Eve. The absence of Peretcher formula in the inscription of Sedim's coffin is worth noticing. The interior east wall is covered with a palace facade decoration and an offering list. The list contains 100 compartments arranged in two horizontal registers. Both rows included 50 compartments. Behind the last entries of both registers, there is one column with an imahu of formula containing the title and the name of coffin's owner. Some curious features in writing of hieroglyphs can be observed. Mutilated head of the
We can't hear you now, or at least at my end. I don't hear the sound. Yes, but it is not loud, but the opposite. So maybe you should speak up.
Yeah, maybe it's the connection. So sorry for this. It is better.
Now it's good. Yeah, it's better.
Some curious features in the writing of hieroglyphs can be observed. Mutilated head of a horned viper. Human figures are truncated or even eliminated in the inscriptions and especially in the offering lists. For example, the sign Bab, a sitting man pouring water, was reduced to vessel pouring water with male head and hands. The determinative of the sitting man is completely missing in the item Chemes sit down in the offering list. According to Nagib Kanabati, truncated form was added from the beginning of Pepe the First reign, since mutilated heads of snakes are attested from Merenre's reign. This date fits with Sedib's burial, in which the seal impression with the name of Merenre was found. The same trend of writing of human figures is attested on a coffin fragment from the burial chamber of Anhemchenenet, the son of Judge Inte. His burial lies not far from Sedib's burial shaft. The representation of Sedib's father and brothers, together with Anhemchenenet, in the wall decoration of the mastaba of the Judge Inte, evinces that Sedib and Anhemchenenet were contemporaries. To avoid writing human figure in the title Elder of the Audience Hall, the hand with cherub scepter is written instead of an old man. Writing of cherub scepter instead of the staff is curious in this context.
And I will continue now with some technological aspects of the coffin. Obviously, the burial chamber was visited by tomb robbers who damaged the cover of the burial pit, as well as the lid of the wooden coffin. They pulled apart the southern part of the limestone lid, and from this place they took out the lid of the coffin. Although the fragments were torn away from one plank, perhaps, the wooden lid survived in its full length. The coffin case remained inside the burial chamber, inside the burial pit, but some of the planks partly decomposed. And in the picture, there are also fragments of a wooden box originally placed in the southeast corner of the burial chamber. So the coffin survived in a number of fragments, and as a result of that, one can well study the details regarding the technology. The coffin represents an example of the rectangular box container with simple decoration, as Veronica just mentioned, and was made of cedar wood. For the construction of the coffin, the east and west walls and the lid were prepared from one wooden plank. Only the west wall had a patch, and the lid had 3 vertical crossbars on the inner side, and in 2 corners there were some kind of reinforcements. The north wall may have been from one piece of wood as well. And interestingly, the walls made of one plank are those that bear the decoration. The south wall was from 2 bigger pieces and 2 thin additional pieces to fill in the empty spaces. And the floor plank was from several pieces as well, at least from 3, but the precise number of them is difficult to establish. And it also needs to be said that the coffin was placed on 3 vertical crossbars inside the burial pit. As far as the joinery is concerned, the north and south planks were attached to the floor plank by the half-flat joint without dowels. But for the connection of the floor plank with east and west walls, they used butt joint with 5 pairs and dowels. Whereas for joining the north and south walls to the east and west walls, the mitre surmounted by butt joint was used. with 3 dowel pairs in each side, and for joining 2 or more planks of one wall, mortices with loose tenons were used. It was and is a common practice in carpentry to use dowels and tenons from hardwood, but if it was the case also in the coffin of Seti, cannot be stated since these parts were not analyzed. One particular feature has to be mentioned as well, and the fragment of the upper northeast corner of the east wall has a red dot on the flat edge. It is in a point of the contact of the case and the lid. Based, for instance, on the study of the inner coffin of Mary Eve from Giza, now in Kunsthistorisches Museum Wien, it can be suggested that the dot on Satib's coffin may signal that another dowel was about to be used here, but it never happened. Let me also briefly mention the state of the decoration. On the outer sides of the coffin, the hieroglyphic signs were shallowly carved in sunken relief, filled with plaster, and at least some of the signs may have been filled with blue color. The wedged eyes had white and black color. The decoration inside was only painted with red, black, white, and yellow. To sum up, the construction as well as the decoration of the coffin of Seti are quite standard. However, one has to, they differ in some particular details, and this needs to be studied more. And we have to bear in mind that the Old Kingdom coffins, let alone the details in the construction, are largely unexplored, and it's a huge topic for another research. And we thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. And again, I'm looking forward to the questions in the discussion. But now let's proceed. And I would like to welcome Angela MacDonald from the University of Glasgow, putting intentions in their place, materializing meaning through spatial dynamics in appeals to the dead. So Angela, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Right, I'm just going to go to the beginning. Can everyone hear me? And hopefully everyone can see my slides.
Yes, at least I do.
Good, okay. We'll assume that everybody else can as well, hopefully. Well, let me add my thanks for the invitation to be here today and to participate in this wonderful series of conversations. I should apologize for my terminology. I've taken to calling letters to the dead appeals to the dead for reasons that I explain in my written up paper that I'm not going to go into just now, but I'm very happy to talk about it if anybody would like to afterwards. Let me see if I can move on my slides. So hopefully I will dovetail with a lot of what you're going to say, all of you, in the paper still to be presented, and I certainly have things in common with Julia's paper to begin with. But I wanted to start by asking the question of why, in the first place, appeals to the dead, more traditionally known as letters to the dead, were written. Why this written form, when we've got plentiful evidence that the spoken word was efficacious, and when we suspect strongly with scholars like John Baines that most of the communication between the living and the dead, particularly informal communication, pleas for help, that kind of thing, would have happened through the voice and not through writing. Baines is right when he says written form seems unnecessary at the end of the day. So why write these appeals down in the first place? And indeed, we might ask, Why write in a particular way? Because what I want to shine a spotlight on today is not so much the content of the appeals, but particularly the way that they are realized in writing and written down. So some examples. I wanted to start with a fairly tricky question to answer, probably one that's impossible, and that's how these things were written. We imagine perhaps somebody who suffered a loss, I'm borrowing a little mourning figure here, who approaches a scribe, another borrowing, and between them, literally and metaphorically, a letter is created. In this case, the Cairo letter on linen, which is a genuine letter. And exactly what form that takes is the crux of what I wanted to speak to you about today, because it's no ordinary letter written in no ordinary way and on no ordinary material. So if we look at it a little bit up close, then as I'm about to explain, and as I explain it at length in my paper, there are materializations of presence here, very much like the ones that Julia was speaking about at the start. We see the appellant, a woman, appear in the text alongside her son. Their presences are coalesced in the first line, the opening line of the letter. And the family dynamics have been carefully arranged. So this is just a little animation to show how this is working. This is the first line in hieratic with Gardner and Zeta's transcription. I'm adding a little S following some eminent scholars before me who've noticed it, starting with Gunn way back in 1930, although it still tends to be missed off in transcriptions. This is how it goes. We have the woman and her son speaking separately in columns that sit alongside each other, as if they are standing alongside each other. And then our columns break down and we have a series of what look like horizontal lines where the two speak as one together. And we can see that in the way that the text is arranged. Finally, they split apart again to make separate wishes for her husband and his father. And then there's one more coming together in a vertical line, a couple of vertical lines. And then finally, we have the two pronouns for each. Interestingly, his comes first this time, because if we're reading directionally, hers should really be read first and then his from right to left. But here the order seems to be reversed from top to bottom, as if there's some attempt to balance their presences and to give prominence to each. I find that absolutely fascinating, that you can actually see these dynamics in the text. And I wonder if the scribe, when he was making this letter and writing it down, did this partially to show the person who was commissioning the text, to say, look, there's you and there's your son, and here's where you speak together, and this is you at the bottom, as a visual thing. I think the medium, of course, had to be significant. And again, this takes us into the world of burial and coffin texts and the Book of the Dead eventually, using linen as a material for the inscription of important text. And it's anybody's guess as to what the significance of the linen was at the end of the day. Did it belong to the dead man in life and it made a connection that way? Was it intended to be wrapped around him after death? Was it part of his burial equipment? I would bet my bottom dollar that there was some kind of personal connection to the material. And of course, looking across the media that are used for appeals to dead, famously, we acknowledge this again and again whenever these are published. And there have been a couple of new publications recently, that the media are unusual. So we have, alongside the traditional formats of papyrus and ostraca, which are actually in the minority, we have a lot of unusual media. So we have one stela, which is strange for a letter, and several ceramic vessels, and of course our linen letter as well. Oops, I should say before I move on, again, messing around with terminology. I'm following Martin Bomis's article in 1999, where he distinguished between bowls and plates, which are larger ceramics, and cups, which are smaller and could fit in the hand. I think that makes a bit more sense of the material and certainly the way that it's inscribed. Now, in terms of content, many people before me have commented on why you would want to choose something like a vessel for a message. And I put just a few of these up here. But again, the material aspect, thinking about, and I love the previous presentation, thinking about the mechanics of how a coffin is constructed and how it's put together and the planning that goes into that. We shouldn't forget that there is a material aspect to these texts that involves handling and holding, that when you put a message on a vessel like the Oxford Cup, then you are meant to put your hands around it. Perhaps the Pitt Rivers doesn't want you to do too much of that kind of thing without gloves. There's mine in purple gloves. But the idea is to pick it up and hold it in your hand. And so you go through this process where you're not just reading a text, but you're picking it up and holding it physically in your hand. And that kind of sense of ownership, holding and possessing, I think is really pertinent to how the message is being delivered. What you're also doing, if you're taking in anything, whether it's words and it's a figurative offering, or whether there was the idea that some kind of food stuff or drink stuff would have been placed in these vessels, and again, we can talk about that if you like, you are still putting yourself in a position to ingest that message. And I don't think we emphasize that enough, that it is supposed to be set up with the purpose of being something that would be taken inside the body. And that is part of how the message is delivered. In terms of thinking about internal and external decoration, again, sort of nodding to the previous paper, just as you would think about with a coffin, with these texts that are on quite challenging three-dimensional surfaces, we have internal and external spaces, and we can see patterns with how they are inscribed and choices that are made. Key texts are inside, possibly because you're dealing with a container, and that's where you would put an important thing, inside a vessel rather than outside it, unless the vessel is too small to have an internal inscription, and then it has to go on the outside. But then, happily enough, your hands or indeed your lips would make contact with the vessel anyway, so you're taking in the message. And again, just briefly, how the text is written is absolutely crucially important. I suppose I'm here to wave the flag today for, as lovely as it is to have these nice normalized transcriptions of texts, we must always go back and look at how they are originally inscribed. We cannot do without doing that. And that's particularly important for appeals to the dead. In addition to texts that are written in columns, we find that with bowls, spiraling texts and circular texts are particularly prevalent, and several bear things like concentric inscriptions that that necessitate turning both in the sense of the production of the text in the first place and the object, and in its reception and in reading it, one has to turn it round, and that has implications. We can look for parallels both in ancient Egypt itself, this wonderful hunting disc of Hemaka on the right-hand side, which is meant to be turned and spun so that you have an eternal cycle of chase. And this wonderful thing that I only became aware of a few years ago at another conference, that has been worked on by Gelliman. So these prayer plates that are produced in Bolivia, made from mud and produced with all kinds of extra materials that are very tactile, that are three-dimensional representations of things like the Lord's Prayer, to teach people as they spin this plate in front of them how to memorize and take the message in. And they keep spinning it until they've learned it, and then they throw the plate away. So I think that's an incredible parallel existing in the modern day for what you can do with a circular text. Is that what's going on with something like the Berlin Bowl? That as you spun it, it didn't have a beginning or an end. It would just keep going round and round and round, and so would the message. And so in this case, would this little feature inside, which again we acknowledge and then don't spend very much of our time considering the purpose of and the function of and its relationship with the text. It's dangerous to isolate marks on their own. And I think Julia has made that point at the beginning, that if we're going to understand a graffito, we can't just look at a name, we need to look at how it's placed on a wall. And we need to do the same with these little, whatever they are, these little signs, symbols, graphemic markers that appear on some of the appeals to the dead. So on the Oxford Cup, we get a sarcophagus done in quite a unique style, larger than the hieratic signs of the text itself, but connected to them in various ways. And in the case of the Berlin Bowl, we get this little figure in the center that we have misleadingly labeled, some of us, as a kind of ancestor bust, because we're thinking about it as a thing divorced from a text. Whereas if we see it in the hieratic, I think we see it slightly differently. The sarcophagus on the Oxford Cup mirrors two mentions of burial on the actual message itself, and seems to draw their essence together to the bottom, to the base of the cup. The message and the cup literally rest on this idea of burial, which is painted on the bottom of the cup, drawing attention to a point. And I think the same thing is going over here. This isn't an ancestor bust. This is a way of heightening the iconicity of a figure that appears in the text. It's the determinative of the unfortunately damaged name of the recipient of this message. And we can see that there are clear affinities there, but she's been given a little bit more shape and substance in the center of the bowl. What did it feel like to be trapped inside this message and to be spun all around? There's a little bit of a disorientation there that I think is important for the delivery of the message. So the effect of all of this, the coordination of what seem to be visual images, I hesitate to name this a hieroglyph or a hieratic sign, it's just there to echo the text, has a particular effect. This idea of trapping a person within a message, placing them inside a container and not letting them escape, and reinforcement. And that's every bit a part of the message's communication as the text itself, and needs to be taken account of. Just very briefly, I didn't mention it in my article that I've written up, but this stela, although it looks very different from the Berlin plate, is operating in a very similar way, that you have the text on one side and you flip it round and here's this representation of the person who's supposed to be receiving it on the other. It's perhaps slightly friendlier, although we should say that she is trapped between two pillars of offering texts, almost as if she wants to receive the offerings, therefore she has to be embedded within them somehow. And I think we could usefully draw parallels between the two. In terms of directing attention, not only circular texts do that, we should look for that kind of dynamism in columns and lines, particularly where those mix. We're too used to seeing addresses in horizontal lines and then a message in a standard letter in columns to pay it much attention. But in the context of these inscriptions that are really making a material feat of their directionality, I think we can probably see that these lines, they draw our eye from right to left as we read them. And that means that inevitably we're pushed somewhat into these columns that march from top to bottom and deliver the message properly. It would be perfectly easy to put an address into a column, and indeed we do have a semi one there. This is how this text starts: a sister addressing her brother. But the name is directed so that it heads into the message properly. An obvious parallel with the way that coffin texts are arranged, we don't get circular text necessarily, although we might perceive the inscriptions that go around the outside of coffins in that way, is the paralleling of elements, where you break down a column and you have two paired elements sitting alongside one another. So I've got two examples here, one from the cow bowl and one from the Louvre cup. But there are plenty other examples. You begin to see what Carlos was speaking about at the beginning, not just individual features, but a system at work that can be manipulated for particular purposes. So here on the Cairo linen letter, we've got a pairing of two maidservants, possibly a third here, that's how it's usually taken, who split a column and are placed alongside each other so that their presences are materialized just as they are spatially aligned. I do wonder, however, just in passing, whether this is not a maidservant, whether this is one of the very complicated members of the family mentioned in this text, and that S she has taken away is expanded upon by this name, just to clarify something. Clarification isn't something that happens a lot in appeals to the dead, so it's nice if it's happening here. So possibly here another sign of materializing presence through a name, again connecting us back into the world of graffiti. But in terms of spatial ideological alignment, where you place two elements alongside each other deliberately, breaking with a pattern of a column, there's no better example than on the Who Bowl, again, where you have the pairing of a male and a female dead person against whom the writer of the letter is hoping to be triumphant. And not only is that materialized by taking them out, putting them alongside one another, but there's also an alignment with what's happening with the determinatives. Now, this is a standard transcription. Again, it continues to be repeated because we don't tend to go back and look at the original hieratic, but these figures are actually placed in a different direction to the rest of the text. We're going from right to left here if we're reading, and we do that with the male and the female dead person, but the determinatives face the other way. They've been flipped around to disorientate them. And again, we might see that system at work in these spinning bowls that are turned round and round and round and round and round and disorientate the person to whom they're speaking. One last example, and then I'm nearly finished. Sorry, Susie, she's going to give me a right for running over time. Is this wonderful example that isn't, even though the corpus of letters or appeals to the dead has expanded drastically in the last few years, this one doesn't tend to be included. And yet it's written on a vessel, it's a little bit later, and it plays with some of the same tricks that we've seen. I should have said with the previous example, a heightened iconicity there is also contributing to the meaning. Much darker, heavier inked figures for the enemies with their hands tied behind their back. And exactly the same thing here. I've given you the message very briefly. We won't have time to read it, but we'll pick out a couple of things. In the hieratic, there are two human signs that are, we could think about this as a type of curtailment in a sense in hieratic. It's for convenience probably rather than to render things harmless. But the seated man is no more than a tick in this text, as it very often is. And the little man holding his hand to his mouth looks like a kind of open infinity sign. Yeah, body, arm, very, very casually rendered, apart from in two places where the iconicity is heightened. The first is here, and this is one of the crux points of the letter. Don't listen to the accusations of the second wife. And the accusations determinative, this little hand to mouth figure, is much larger and rendered just with a little bit more care than the others. And then this particularly at the bottom, it looks utterly different from all other little seated man signs. And it really needs to be acknowledged, not only in our transcriptions, if we're going to do such things, but certainly maybe even in our translations, which calls into question how we think of determinatives. They don't just sit quietly at the ends of lines, they demand to be taken into account sometimes in our translations. Absolute picture of devotion at the bottom there. Right. Last slide. So in terms of pulling this all together, I think the key thing to take away from all of this is the materialization of a message, that you don't just write in lines or columns, that you're thinking about the spatial orientation of your text, not as an annoyance for Egyptologists who have to then standardize it into nice lines, but as a way of delivering the message, meaning is materialized in these forms, and we need to take that into account. And it's to do with the gifting of agency from the person who writes these appeals. I'm almost sure that's always a professional scribe, to the person who is sitting, looking at the composition and seeing themselves. And all these tricks, these materialized tricks, appear before their eyes. This is about affect and effect. You want to cause something to happen, and you want to affect somebody's emotions as well in delivering your message. And to do that, we must always look at these messages in the original and in their context. Okay, thank you. Sorry for running over.
Thank you very much. It was super fascinating. So I would have been able to listen to it up until the evening, but yeah, unfortunately we have to now proceed with our tight schedule. And so Jean-Pierre Petznik, he's not able to give his talk from Hentimentiu to Hentimentiu, but I would like to ask Cesar Herrera Mendez to present the article you wrote together with Carlos, Osiris as written in the pyramid text and the coffin texts.
Thank you, Susanna. Well, I'm gonna share you my screen. Are you listening to me?
Yes, properly? I hear you, and I can also see your screen.
Okay,
so
cool.
You can go ahead.
Perfect. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for being here. Angela, I would like to have that cup at home. Well, this case study has been developed collaboratively between Carlos and me. I'm sure that many of you already know Carlos, so you will know that I am not him. Hi, I am Cesar. Nice to meet you. This case study has its origin in a case study of the current OCR PT-CT project in the synergy with MORTEXVAR. We wanted this optical character recognition software to find every one of the names of Osiris in the coffin text. But for this, it was necessary to manually search for each one of these spellings to teach them to the machine. So we got something like this. We told the machine, this is how Osiris is breathing. And this is more or less what we were expecting to get. Anyways, this resulted in a very interesting thing. It resulted in a list that shed light on an interesting topic, and which is that variations on the name of Osiris in the pyramid text and the coffin text had not been collected in there entirely until now, and many of them have been collected as post-Middle Kingdom variations. And thus, we have started a study in which we collect each of the spellings in their context, their time, location, sarcophagus, spelling, and so on, which is still in progress, by the way. In any case, the preliminary study in which we collect the variation could show light, could show symbolic meanings and linguistic connotation not previously studied. These spellings, just to make it clear, could be classified into main groups. The first one and the earliest, consisting on the presence of the eye and the throne, and the second one consisting on the flesh and the mouth signs. Anyways, there's a lot of variation here, and we even can find a mix of both variations. The first variation that we need to mention, being the earliest, is the lack of determinative. This was actually very usual in the Old Kingdom pyramid tests, perhaps because they did not want to employ determinatives depicting living creatures in the burial chamber. This also happens in some non-royal monuments after the reign of Teti. Perhaps another variation related to this lack of signs is the lack of any of the other three signs, perhaps in this case motivated by the lack of space. The Necher sign also appears as a determinative of several gods. This specific case was thought to firstly appear in a very concrete context in the 18th dynasty and later in the third intermediate period onwards. However, it occurs in multiple examples of the coffin text. Despite there seems not to be a specific reason for this substitution other than that both signs are the equivalent of the idea to the idea of deity or God. The determinative is also substituted by the falcon in some coffin text spells, perhaps as a variation by context. However, the examples that we have got are not so conclusive, and there is much variation in these specific parts, which will be double-checked before publication, obviously. The determinative of the seated god with the Atef crown may come from the Osiris classic iconography, which sometimes is even enough to depict the god name by itself, like in this case. Perhaps more enigmatic is the presence of the leaf sign, the sign M17 in the Gardiner sign list. It is difficult to interpret it as a sort of phonetic complement for the eye, or as an indicative that it may be read as iri, the verb make or do, perhaps referring to this cyclic process of new life, just because the eye is simply not located close to the leaf. On the other hand, it may be motivated by the lack of space or by reluctance to use dangerous human signs in the mortuary realm again. In some other Middle Kingdom spellings, we find the vertical line as well, which is highly likely in this case a space filler or a replacement sign for the seated god, like in this case. I don't know if you are seeing my mouse.
Yes, we do. We do.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. Well, not only the determinative is occasionally replaced, the throne was changed by the balance stamp in some pyramid test copies on Middle Kingdom documents. These signs have different phonetic values, as you know, but both were identified with the throne in earlier times. On the other hand, both the shape similarities and the identification of this sign with the balance could refer to the Osiris judgment symbolically. The throne was also replaced by the portable seat sign. Allen suggested that this variation was designed by space economy. If we take the coffin text as the earliest attestation, however, we then could suggest a sort of symbolic meaning to this sign, perhaps understanding it as a sort of funerary bed. Well, as you know, the phonetic value of the I is ear, so it seems rationally that this might be substituted by the mouth, which is R. This change may also be motivated by the similarity of both signs, and also some studies on the Osiris etymology point to the presence of this phoneme, despite this is not completely proved. The name of Osiris is sometimes also followed by the bread sign. This in the coffin text normally, well, this is normally a female termination, as you know. However, in this case, it might represent a symbolic future, since graphic similarities of this god and Isis may point that both names were thought to be together. So these signs could be pointing to this connection. The presence of the solar disk in the Osiris name was believed to occur during the the 19th dynasty onwards. It also appears in the, well, this, however, also appears in the coffin text spell 45, perhaps as a confusion or as an identification with the sun god in this spell, which is referenced in multiple times. The connection between this god, between the sun god and Osiris in this spell, well, it is also suggested in some other pyramid text spells, and later in the coffin text, and even the Book of the Dead later. On the other hand, it could be just a simplification of the eye sign, being just a pupil in this case. However, in the coffin of Ukhotep, we saw a detail which could be related to this solar Osirian parallelism. The throne was replaced by a staircase in the inside of the coffin front side, which is looking to the east, just over this false door. There are also some reference to the staircase used to ascend in the pyramid text, the coffin text, the Book of the Dead, which locates Osiris on this staircase where he waits for Re. We can see it also in the Osiris judgment in the Book of Gates, and even as a physical element in some funerary artifacts like this one. We could even highlight the third dynasty step pyramid and the etymology of the word mar or meher for pyramid, which could be translated as a place or instrument of ascent, since both roots are homoorganic in this case. And thus, stairs may be used as a sort of podium of Osiris in his judgment, or as an interface between two areas through ascent, well, the rising east of the sun in the 6th hour of the night. This specific case could be suggesting the Oriental ascent and resurrection of the deceased in a comparison to the god Osiris. On the other hand, the second main spelling family, which, as we said, is focused on the flesh sign and the mold signs, it could have its origin in the Middle Kingdom coffin text as well, where we can see a lot of variation, but normally maintaining the structure, some free signs and the seated god determinative, apart from some exceptions. But the word flesh, on the other hand, was used in the New Kingdom Netherworld books by itself or as Iwef Ra to identify the sun god during his nocturnal journey to represent his rebirth. If we read this spelling as Iwef Usir, it may also express a similar idea of rebirth in the netherworld. However, this symbolism is not completely evidenced in the Middle Kingdom coffin texts. Perhaps it could just be translated as is, well, transliterated as is, and translated as some kind of testicle, which fits quite well in this context. Finally, and just to introduce the topic, this is a study which may shed light on the real meaning of the locution Wasir and Pian, especially if we are able to study every case in its context. This is firstly attested in non-royal texts from the 6th dynasty, where the name of Osiris often appeared before the deceased name, followed by the demonstrative Pn or Tn in the case of feminine. It also happens in the pyramid text and the coffin text, among other mortuary artifacts later. Whether or not this location suggests an identification of the deceased with Osiris is a topic of discussion, since whereas some coffin texts identified the deceased with Osiris, some others only imply a relationship or dependence, being more some kind of resources depending on the situation. Which seems more interesting to highlight here is that this specific case in which an N occurs between the Osiris name and the deceased name. This case was mentioned actually by Smith as an example of an expression that will become quite common in the 21st dynasty onward, translating it as the Osiris of this and the name of the deceased, being the locution a direct genitival construction. Nevertheless, there are some problems here, and we think that this case is not definitive for the following reasons. The sarcophagus, this one, the G1T, is well known by its error. The offering formula in a horizontal line is also very rare within the coffin text, and the spell is a collection of texts related to the vignette of a boat. The parallel here in A1C, as you can see, has not the N, and finally, the expression occurs within a dative structure. So because of this, we concluded that this is probably a mistake in this specific case. Well, I think there are a lot of cases here. There are a lot of spellings. So if you want to ask later, right now, no, because this is not the moment. It's in 15 minutes, I think. We will be very happy to answer. If not me, Carlos is around here. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. There were already during the talks, we had the impression that there are many connecting points. So I am very much looking forward to this discussion section. As far as I understood, Carlos, you have some questions. We could maybe start the discussion with these questions. I also have my own questions, but after we started with these questions, Carlos, I would encourage you to post your questions, further questions, either in the chat or just simply turn on your microphone. I think both are completely fine. And we also have, on YouTube, the possibility to post a question there. So we discussed that maybe we will come to those questions posted on YouTube towards the end. But up until then, feel free to post anything that comes to your mind. So Carlos.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I have a question that I think is quite common to all the presentations you've made, is that where do we put the individual cases? I mean, usually in many cases, we consider that this individual case is an exception to a system which is described previously, or is kind of a stable structure. But in my opinion, some of these individual cases are like particular cases in the system. So, or relevant cases that can make us think about the system itself. So if we have to move in some way or to adapt the system to certain cases, not to keep considering them as exceptions, but very telling cases, precisely about the system, not against or outside it. That it's more a reflection than a question. And I think Julia and Angela, Cesar also have brought this in the examples of different spellings or different formats in the writing, and also in the secondary epigraphy. So that's just a general reflection about the materials you have bring together today. Yeah, and you can respond as you want. I mean, in the order, or yeah, Susie will tell. You can raise your hand or anything.
Angela.
So thank you for that, Carlos. And I think that that's an interesting way to bring us all together. I think for my material, there are what look like some exceptional examples, but I think they absolutely fit within a broader system. And I think once we acknowledge that there are patterns going on, then what we see are almost kind of hyperizations of aspects of the writing system that are present anyway. There are all these potentials and things that you can do. And a lot of the examples that I'm presenting, even although they look exceptional, they are drawing on absolutely firm, established facets of the writing system. So things like, and what's interesting is once you acknowledge that you're looking at a pattern that is part of a system, then you might see parallels across other materials. So you're not just looking at exceptional writings and appeals to the dead, but you're looking at ways of putting together texts and using internal and external spaces on a coffin, or you're looking at the placement of graffiti in particular areas to draw in elements of the surroundings and make them part of the textual environment. And I think what you're seeing are, kind of wonderful realizations of the potentials of the system that needn't always be there in every piece of writing. But I think I begin to look at things with slightly new eyes. So I think Veronica and Marie showed one of the beautiful travertine vessels that accompanied the burial that you guys were discussing. And there's a column of inscriptions sympathetically placed to rise with that vessel. So the choice, rather than to inscribe something around, but to create a space where the text kind of rises or falls or stands in a column, can be read sympathetically. So that's a case where, directionality possibly comes into effect. Similarly, it would be interesting to look at directionality with Julia's names on the walls of the mastaba. Do they stand? Are they vertical? I know that you've had similar materials where you've played around with orientations that way. So definitely, I think these can be seen as a wider system.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Okay, thank you, Susie. Yeah, thank you for all these great presentations, and for your comment, Angela. And speaking about patterns, so from my point of view, it's always difficult to find a pattern, because this pattern might be influenced by so many factors. And for example, with view to your presentation, Cesar, there are so many reasons for these variations. So you told us it might be space, a lot of space for some signs or not, individual decisions, so many reasons might have influenced these patterns. And so I'm questioning myself also with you to my talk on Friday, are we able to find the reasons for these different variations? As maybe we don't have to do so, but it would be good if we could decide, okay, this is the reason for this variation, or this is the reason for that variation. And maybe we can speak about this question at the end of the workshop on Friday again. But this is something what I always have in mind when we are talking about variability. So what is the reason? And so many factors may have influenced this. So I think it's very difficult also to see a pattern in, although we hope we do so, and then we can also transfer it to other material. I think it's a big question, or something that we have to keep in mind, that a lot of factors might have influenced these patterns, and also the variations, the reasons for variations. And so I think this is something, so I don't know how is your feeling about this, but this is something what I'm always asking myself when I think, oh, this could be the pattern, but so What do you think about these things?
Yeah, I think probably Cesar and Carlos probably come in seeing as they talked about the broadest variety of patterns, and I guess this is what you have in mind. I mean, there's a little bit of variation in the orthographies of particular words. I suppose the example that I talked about was the Munich vessel at the end, where you have one set of ways of representing what should be a little kind of seated man sign, and then one big variation, and then, well, at least to me, reasons behind that choice that motivate that choice begin to suggest themselves, particularly when you're looking across the corpus of material. If instead of, you don't necessarily have space constraints, because instead of using a small and obtrusive sign, you're making it much larger and much more prominent. So if the idea behind that is to heighten meaning, and that becomes part of the system, that one reason for variation and deviating from the norm, I guess, if the norm exists, is that you want to call attention, then that can be applied. So for Cesar's presentation, which was great on Osiris, then the staircase, instead of the throne, or the kind of low chair that you suggest might have funerary connotations as opposed to the tall. I think it possibly is our, well, at least the way that I've taught Egyptian in the past to my students, I've fallen back too much on the idea that it is a matter of spacing sometimes, that, a low sign as opposed to a tall sign, particularly in writings of something like Osiris, whereas your presentation makes me think again and puts it alongside all these variations in my corpus of material that don't seem to be motivated by space reasons, and makes me question it again. How wonderful if you have, I think it's our downfall and the great advantage of the Egyptian writing system, all that flexibility, that you do have this world of possibilities for how to render something materially, as long as it's understandable. At the point where it's no longer understandable, then you're in trouble. But as long as it's comprehensible and it makes sense, then there is a pattern. Yes, but it's frustrating not always to understand the reasons behind it.
Cesar, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, it is quite frustrating. Yeah, actually, yes, because well, in my opinion, there is a lot of information, and in this moment it has to be everything analyzed manually. We are not exactly sure how many times happens each spelling, where exactly we have an idea of how is this happening, but it is difficult to see patterns without a clear a detailed study of all the cases. And there is a lot of sarcophagus, and not all of them are conserved properly. So this is gonna take a long time, I think. I'm not sure about that. Or perhaps, we can see here the importance, the relevance of the digital humanities. This could be completely automatized by optical recognition software, if we are able to do that. But well, this is talking about the future.
Yeah, and of course, then it comes again the problem that Angela discussed, that there is the addition of the bug, but of course, it is already not the original hieratic texts.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's just to make things complicated, but yes, but hopefully in the future it will be. And I also wanted to just introduce or I would like to ask, and then I leave you, Dina, to say a few words that, and how do we identify also what is really a mistake and what is just something that we we think a mistake, but maybe it is not a mistake at all. So yeah, but Dina, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Actually, this was exactly the thing I would like to bring in, because often if we see a feature, a pattern, we, like, at least in literature, we can read people say it's a mistake, it's a deviation, it's not correct, this is misunderstood. And even more, like when I work with coffin text or pyramid text, I always come to the idea that actually all of it seems to be intentional. So perhaps one of the approaches, the first approach could be to say, I take it seriously. So the variation I encounter, I have to take it seriously, and then I can think about its functionality. So just as a matter of approaching this, these many patterns and like not understanding the system behind them would be just to say they are first intentional and second, they are functional. So they are not just there for fun, but there is some reasoning, some meaning behind it. But this would be just a working hypothesis, and it always depends on what we are looking at, right? This is how I'm trying to look on the material. And yeah, we'll see what you will say on Friday.
Thank you. I see Julia and Jorge. I don't know who was first. Sorry. Then Jorge? Do I pronounce your name correctly?
Right. It's Jorge, but to be
Jorge,
honest, close to everybody mispronounce my name, so I'm used to it.
Okay, sorry.
But to come back to you, Dina, I do think you raise a very important point that this is actually also the reason I follow Rogolsky for the whole idea that the term corruption is really poor because it has an automatic negative connotation in a language and therefore is problematic. However, the assumption that there are no errors is basically how I usually grab back. I have no idea where I got this quote from. I might have thought it myself, but I doubt it. But I usually say it's arrogant to assume that the Egyptians did not make a mistake, but it's just as arrogant to do the opposite. And sorry for the blatant plug here. I have an article that is waiting to be published. It's already been accepted and everything, that talks about what I consider actual errors in the coffin text specifically. So, for example, there's a case where you have in B3BO where where a text originally in the first person has been completely set into the third person by replacing the first person with the name of the owner. And there you have many cases where you can simply see that the scribe or artist, or how you're going to call it, that they replaced simply replaced the seated man with the name. And because, for example, the dative is not in the correct place in a sentence, but it actually occurs a time as well where Sechem Kaf is completely destroyed because you have the Sechem, then a name, then an Aleph, then a name. That is absolutely an error. There cannot be a doubt there that that's an error that's not intentional. I do absolutely agree with you that we should take every variation seriously and not automatically assume it's an error, but it's the same case that there are blatant errors there. So that's a bit of the caveat I would like to put to it. But in general, I do agree with your statements.
I can also chip in with a perspective from graffiti. I'm really sorry we've now hit 12. So if I make incomplete sentences, it's because of that. In graffiti, particularly for old Penguin graffiti with names, there are lots of things that would often, I think, be described as errors. I think they are precisely the reasons why graffiti tends to completely be dismissed as for its inclusion as a sort of serious type of text when we collect things like names, right? There are very few graffiti that are included in what is currently published and available in terms of our lexicons for onomastics. And yet it is precisely in graffiti where we see the most variation, both in terms of orthography, also in terms of spatial arrangement, in terms of interaction with like the wider sort of monument, the fact that people are creatively making new connections between a name and an image, for example. Graffiti is one of the sort of sites at which there is a huge amount of variation, so it's interesting just for that reason. But there are also many, many, many cases that I have seen just in the Teti Permanent Cemetery, also in Saqqara, where you're sort of like, I actually have no idea how to read this. And it's like, is this a problem with me, or is it a problem with the expression, which is often trying to emulate a more fully hieroglyphic style? And so you have this mixture of hieratic and fully hieroglyphic signs, which it's a complex language. The writers are also grappling with the variation and the complexity of their own language when they're expressing their own names. And so it's sort of like, again, I think probably there are errors, but I just don't actually know if error is a word that sort of encapsulates actually what's happening with that inscription. And it's so much more interesting than it just being an error. And yeah, even in things around orientation, sure, it might lexically look complete if it was sort of just transcribed, but actually when you look at it, it's actually very interesting because it sort of mixes its orientation, it often mixes its signs. And we see those in other texts as well, but graffiti, I think, is interesting. And the other thing about graffiti is also that it's very poorly published. So in fact, we can't find these variations easily as researchers coming to the material. And this is a problem also for figural graffiti, where things can sometimes be sort of missed as being textual. Again, I think this is a poor division of our material, but I think there are many graffiti that actually really do bridge those realms, and they're completely dismissed as even being ancient, which is a loss for us. So yeah, I'm going to stop now because that's like it's a rambling thought thread, and I think Runa wants to say something.
You raised many interesting points, and I see that Rune would like to comment on this.
Yes, thank you. So I think this is obviously a classical discussion that comes up a lot. How to what extent can we see what the ancient actor was up to, and I think it's worth also confronting that what it's kind of I wouldn't say a bias, but it's certainly a tendency in scholarship, perhaps in human thinking more generally, that we're looking for intentionality. We want to know, did the person do this on purpose or didn't they? So that tends to be sort of the underlying assumption when we're talking about errors. No, they didn't do it intentionally. They did it because they were stupid or careless or whatever it might be. So there's no intentionality here. And then on the other hand, we have things where people seem to be breaking rules deliberately or following rules deliberately. But perhaps it's worth also thinking about this as something of a continuum. In fact, whenever we are doing anything, we are following particular rules, particular habits. We are, while at the same time realizing that we are under some form of control by the circumstances that happen to dictate our engagement with the discourse in question. So maybe we can find a vocabulary that allows us to sort of go between those extremes of something that is absolutely conscious and intentional on the one hand, and something that is completely unintentional on the other, and then also see that there's actually sort of a that's a perpendicular axis to the question of system and variation. It's not necessarily that when you are making a mistake you're breaking the rules, whereas when you are when you're doing something consciously, you're following the rules. It can actually be the other way around as well. So just to muddy the waters even more, I think there's a large gray area in there that we could also see if we can come to terms with.
Thinking about the variation you were telling, or the possibility of graduate or make gradable the variations. I mean, totally unexpected or totally unintentional is a clear error, as Joke was saying. But and you expect that maybe in one document you are going to find many of these statistically, because the scribe is no good, so he makes a lot of mistakes. On the other part, you have things clearly intentional, which probably will be more anchored to the specific context in which they appear. So like the sign that Angela showed before, the big man in one of the bows. one of the big A1. Even in your paper, you say, Angela, is this the same sign as the other one? So until what point we can consider the small A1 in hieratic as the big one, which is not also the typical A1 in hieratic, but a different one. Are they, of course, is the city man, but is that the same sign, really? Or how can we modulate we have in our head the idea that A1 is a sign in Egyptian. But in fact, we have very different hieroglyphic and hieratic, and something in the middle, and all of them, we put it in the class A1. Until what point is our class or the mental class of an Egyptian? That's one of the things I've been thinking about when I was reading so until what point we can, how to say, stretch the idea of variation, when that elastic thing breaks and we have a different thing.
I think it gets very difficult, doesn't it? Because we want to organize, and back to my patterns and your table that you and Cesar presented for all the variant forms of Osiris. We want to organize, and we want to apply some principles that make sense. And so we apply all these terms, and we say things like hieratic or hieroglyphic, and we say things like A1, meaning the seated man, exactly as you said, and think of that as a kind of broad unity, or even a category where you might have a prototype in the center and then sort of, kind of outliers along the fuzzy edges. But there are cases, so I think the A1 sign on the Munich vessel is not a unity, and it's not meant to be that, and it probably also, the curtailed form that's just a tick is doing its own thing in hieratic and isn't to be taken as an equivalent of the hieroglyphic sign. I think the whole transcription process, as necessary as it is dangerous, because it means that we train ourselves to think of equivalence, and then exactly what we're talking about, variations fall by the wayside by the dozen, because we're making automatic decisions that something is just a variant form of something else, and the variation doesn't matter necessarily. Whereas in the Munich vessel, it absolutely does. That's a deviation in form, and you're meant to react to it differently. As much as it's a necessary thing for us to have designations for signs, we want to be able to talk about things like A1, the seated man. We have to be very careful, because within, you were also asking at the beginning of the session what the contribution of the case studies would be. And the case studies remind us that within particular contexts, there are scribal practices that are being observed that maybe are consistent within that context, but won't easily map exactly elsewhere. And you have to learn what those scribal habits and intentions are as much as you can within that context. So there in the Munich vessel, there's a conscious deviation between a very abbreviated form that doesn't need to be particularly iconic, and then one that really, really does. And it has its own meaning, I think. And I would also say, I'd be curious to see what the original sign is in the original coffins behind De Buck's transcription of that little flesh sign. Is it always the same, or is De Buck looking at a sign? Julia was talking about graffiti that are kind of R signs, mouth signs that don't really look like mouths sometimes, and it's a little bit of a bungling because of the medium that's being worked with, that it's being scratched onto a surface. And I mean, I've never tried inscribing hieroglyphs into wood, but it must be hard. So if you're going to scratch signs, exactly how much variation is there? How nicely does that little flesh sign appear? Or are we dealing with more variants? I remember being quite shocked years back when I was a student, going to the photographic archive in Leiden and looking at the coffin text in the original, and just I wasn't looking for giraffes, but they happened to pop up on my radar, and by God, there aren't many giraffes to be had in the original text, and they're all over De Buck. So if you were going to look for Ser, to foretell with a giraffe, then you'd think it's all over in the coffin text. There's lots of them, and there really isn't. There's a lot of variations in the carved or painted forms of the signs. So we've got to be really careful. Yep.
I agree, Angela, and also I'm really struggling to put sentences together. In terms of our paleographies as well, when we're looking for individual signs, just sticking to Old Kingdom hieratic, for example, even the most recent paleography, which is really excellent if you work in Saqqara, is primarily built on builders' inscriptions, these painted inscriptions. So if you work on something that's scratched, the orthography is not well represented in the existing tools that we have. That doesn't mean that we can't do this research. It just introduces a layer of complication for looking for variation, and to sort of justify. I don't know. I chose a case study actually based on a need that had already been expressed, that this is a tomb that's really interesting for the different types of inscriptional modes that hasn't been discussed. So that was also why I sort of chose it. But it is also, it doesn't really fit what we tend to see at Saqqara. There are very few painted inscriptions like these at all, like in terms of these nice painted fully hieroglyphic inscriptions that record the date of a burial. I have been thinking, although I didn't want to put it in the paper and I won't put it in the volume, is that this type of declaration of the recording of the burial must have existed in some other format. It's just interesting that it has been painted onto the wall and over the relief is very, very unusual in Old Kingdom art. It is so unusual for a painted inscription like that to go over an existing relief. So there's something interesting. I don't have a solution. If somebody has one, I'm delighted. Please send it to me. I don't have an explanation for this, but it is unusual. But I think that this a written record of the date of the burial might have been existed on some other ephemeral material that was posted or pasted to the door of the tomb, for example. I mean, could anyone read it? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question either. But yeah, I think the case study is exceptional, but also allows us to ask or point to important lines of research that could happen in the future.
Yeah, to quickly come back, Angela, to what you mentioned as well about the flash sign, how well defined it is. It very simply, it isn't. This is partly because we're dealing with material that runs the gambit from Fisher type 3A to 4. So we're going from something that's basically hieratic to something that is near hieroglyphic in the different witnesses. Of course, there are regional preferences. So Mer and Asyut are usually more on the hieroglyphic side, where Del Bersha is very much more on the hieratic side, and therefore the signs will change. So in the more hieratic forms, it will simply use the hieratic formats, so the circle with the little tick on there for the flash sign, where in a certain Mer and Asyut coffins, it is a near perfect hieroglyphic representation of the flash sign. So that varies rather broadly. That doesn't make life easier. And although, based on my own observations, the book's transcriptions are horrendous, are remarkably precise, some details are automatically lost when you move from a cursive script to hieroglyphic script, which is also actually the reason I'm really happy with the Aku project in Mainz, because they're actually tackling this rather problematic issue that we are currently glancing over. But you also have the problem here, just because of my current work as well, is that I have the problem you always hit when I do agree with that the paleographical approach is very important, useful, and necessary for variation. But at the same time, you also always have to keep a practical aspect in mind. And it is simply not practical to make sign lists that contain 20 or 40 different types of A1, even though all those classes will exist. But it's not practical to some extent. So are you going to make a distinction between the arm being the front elbow being at 45 degrees or 50 degrees? Are you going to make a difference for that one? And this is the whole problem. And I'm not saying that there's an answer for this at all. I'm tackling with this problem the whole time. Just where do you draw the border? And sorry, for another one that I just, before I forget to mention it, actually, I find your example about the different sign use rather interesting. And I'm wondering if it might not be an idea to actually start implementing a system to create, to to make the hieroglyphic typeset, if you work with a hieroglyphic transcription, if you make it bold versus the normal form, to make a distinction between the two signs in these cases. Because I completely agree, it's really important to clarify that this is an important distinction.
It's just how you go about doing it. And again, you know, what you were saying about you know, where does a variation become meaningful? You know, if you've got a hand, if it's raised up high, or it's just marginally high, or if it's over the head, you know, all sorts of little things. I suppose at the end of the day, it depends on what you want to do with all of these signs. So if you are trying to publish a study that's taking in hundreds of examples, then yeah, it becomes impractical to split all these signs into different categories. But it's hard because, you know, are we treating hieroglyphs and hieratic too much like a language that we would expect? We're kind of downplaying some of the visual aspects. You know, in painting, I don't think anybody would come up with a classification system for human beings the way that Gardner did for hieroglyphs. And we have to allow for the fact that, despite the fact that there is a certain formality in the hieroglyphs that you know, you might see in an inscription, will broadly play to those types that Gardner devised. A lot of the times in the text that we're looking at, there are significant deviations, and we need to be a little careful. It's when we say things like, okay, let's gather all the A1 signs and put them together and say that they mean this, yeah, and that they're doing this, then you're missing the point, particularly when you go into the cursive realm, where you've got just that wee bit more flexibility, I think, sometimes to play around and vary forms. And sometimes we're back into I like the idea of a continuum or a spectrum. We're back in there again, where we can't decide exactly how intentional something should be. But I like Dina's idea that we start at least by taking it seriously rather than dismissing it. I'm not saying that there are no errors, because obviously we all see that. We can see what errors have been corrected in some texts. But yeah, it makes me nervous when things get abstracted from their original context, I suppose, and that you try to say, okay, here's this sign, and this is what it does, and here's 50 texts that use it, and they're all doing the same thing with it. Because I think the original form, certainly in Appeals to the Dead, there are some signs where, you know, if there's a slight variation in form, I suppose we haven't really introduced the difference between semographic signs and non-semographic signs, which is another divide that's difficult to draw and will be another spectrum rather than a black or white, yes or no. But meaning-bearing signs, I think they bear meaning because they can be heightened and nuanced in particular ways, and it's to our detriment if we ignore that because we want to publish something with a nice TypeScript hieroglyph. I think we probably, you know, it depends on what we want to do. Sometimes we've got no option but to say, right, okay, here's the norm, and these things conform reasonably well and these things don't. But I think where we have the option to look at these case studies, that's what they have to offer. They're warning signs that we have to be a little bit careful with how we you know, pick these things up. So
Dina, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to add something up to that, because we were talking about single signs now, kind of like the paleography of one determinative or classifier, whatever. But if we think about it in a more broader way, I mean, everything is in context, right? So a sign, a hieroglyph is contextualized with others. It's a logogram, phonogram, phonetic complement, whatever. And generally, I had I noticed that the level of graphemes, or the graphematic or orthographic level of variation, is very often like not very in focus of studies, because it's perhaps too complicated to deal with that, or because people think that doesn't make sense because it's not a matter, it's not functional, it's not a matter of variation, or does not have any meaning. But I think if we start to think about it in more contextualized way, so then we would discover that there are meaning-driven decisions, like why is there let's say a I would call it graphematic extension, or why is there an orthographic reduction? Like, there are choices. These choices have been made. So I think there is also some reason behind it. And in the last years, there have been some works on that, especially with the pyramid text, for example, by Christina Hutter, who has found out or like shown why this is the case, why the same word heru, like horse, is written in 5 different versions on the same wall. So there might be reasons for that. So just going from the single sign problem, like extending it to a more contextualized way of seeing text also as graphic media.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I mean, absolutely. I took one sign as an example, but it's very dangerous as well, I think, I began my Egyptological career by thinking about determinatives, but now I see that as a function that goes beyond the signs that we would call just that. So, what about Julia's sign, where you have Julia's graffito, where you have somebody's name alongside a figure that didn't originally belong to it? That kind of is behaving, in the manner of a determinative, and yet it's not really part of the writing. I don't know if we would transcribe it that way. We hit upon these things. You need the context. Context utterly is always key. Yep.
Any comments? Because I just wanted to ask you, Angela, because I read your article, but maybe not everybody had time to read. So why you use the appeal to the dead? It's not labor. So why you use this phrase? Sure. Because then I would like to to have a question to that.
Sure. I used to, when I talked about this at length, I don't know if you know the sitcom Blackadder. But in the second series of Blackadder tries to find a wise woman, and when he finally, narrows her down, he's told 2 things you have to know about the wise woman. First, she's wise, and second, she's a woman, and he treats this with scorn and derision. Letters to the Dead, it immediately sets us off looking for letters, does it not? And we're beginning to question that. One of the latest publications, Julia Hazai, is saying, well, even although we say letters, it doesn't just mean that we have to look for letters to put text into this corpus. And I think terms are a very dangerous thing. I mean, a lot of the texts that seem to fit in terms of, we're back to this idea of patterns, a lot of the similar orthographic and spatial tricks that you see repeated that seem to have similar themes, if they're not formatted as a letter, then that doesn't matter. They're still a member of the corpus. So I think aligning with appeals to the living, where the dead are supposedly speaking to the living, this is the living speaking to the dead. I like the parallelism there, and I also like the kind of breadth of the term. It's something that Sylvie Donat had talked about years ago. She'd mentioned that letters isn't a great term, and we need to think a little bit more broadly and out of the box. But it's because it's become entrenched. I mean, how would anybody like it if we wanted to rename the coffin texts? I don't think we will. But it wouldn't go down well, right? So, but these things absolutely, at least the coffin texts are on coffins, most of them, but letters to the dead are not always letters. And so I think we need a little bit of a broader term. So that was my idea, to break that down a little bit.
Yeah, thank you very much, because I found your argument absolutely convincing. And it's also resonates very well with the appeal to the living, which you mentioned that
Well, the only thing is, and I see this a little bit in the article, is that whereas appeals to the living are very formulaic, appeals to the dead absolutely are not. They take all sorts of different forms, but they do seem to have at their core, I think we're not looking so much for a format, we're looking for an intention to fix a problem, to change the world, to get a message across. And that happens in the space between the living and the dead by the agency of a scribe. And so that then creates this category. It also opens it up, if we're thinking about communications and trying to persuade the dead and influence them, then what Julia mentioned briefly, those Kubit el Hawa bowls that Adolf found years ago and published in the 70s, that have these strangely arranged kind of spoked inscriptions, those absolutely fit. They are not letters. They are not asking for anything. They don't even have that. And yet the way that they're arranged, if you read the spatial dynamics on them, then you wonder if there's a place for intentions, if they're set up to be, you know, to open a channel between the living and the dead. I was going to ask actually Veronica and Marie about these strange mud cakes that were inside the coffin, if you had any comment on those, because speaking about creating something material that will open a channel between the living and the dead, what's going on with those?
We don't know yet. I'm sorry.
No. I mean, maybe it's impossible to know again, but it's interesting to see that as some kind of intervention, right? Some kind of interface. You put something inside a coffin. Does it, I mean, I immediately start thinking about parallels between something that you would take, a bowl, a cup, a vessel stand, a piece of linen, that you can then place within a mortuary context, if we're certain that happened. I'm not quite sure that I followed Julia Hazai in thinking about all the mechanics that you can read from the text themselves. But as soon as you create that nexus between the living and the dead, it opens a channel, and then, you know, you can take advantage of the channel to deliver a message. Or sometimes a couple of people jump on the bandwagon, like the misplaced stela, that seems to have two separate messages on. But there might be other ways of doing that, in opening up that channel, just to leave the potential, without putting it down in writing, just to leave that channel open in a physical way, a physical object, like blocking open a door so it doesn't shut. I don't know, but it's interesting to see. You said they're mud and sand, right? Not ceramic, but interesting that something can be shaped. So.
I have a question for Veronica and Maria. How many of the mud there were?
Around 25.
Okay, because I was thinking of the references to the eating portions in the coffin text, to the sky and to the earth, not to a kind of so some contact between the objects you put inside the coffin and the text, which is also interesting. Another very interesting serie llamada aquí, for example, tomorrow's article is about the connection between the representations in the object in the friezes and the objects, the real goods, burial goods in the tombs. But there is also the third level of the text, how the texts are connected to the representations and the objects. No? So I was thinking maybe it could be related, but 25 is not a number that arranges anything in the coffins, in the text. Yeah.
Angela, yeah, go ahead.
If we're asking each other questions now, then I was going to ask as well, Cesar, you were talking about the reed leaf sign in writings of Osiris, and wondering what that might be doing. And Carlos and I have talked in the past about first person signs and that A1 sign, again, if we want to call it that, the seated man and its various roles. I wonder whether that, because you've got certain relationships that happen within the script. So if you're writing a first person suffix pronoun, then you might use that little seated man sign, but equally you might use that reed leaf sign, and the can be used together in similar contexts. So Julia and I had been looking at the text of SAR input, where that alternation certainly happens. And I wonder if, because there is that possibility of using that phonetic sign instead of the little man, the fully realized man in hieroglyphs or hieratic, if you want, that it takes on some measure of semanticity, that it becomes a meaningful sign in itself when you're looking to represent some kind of like human being, but without wanting to show a human being, which is obviously something that's going on in coffin texts. And I wondered if we can align it with another sign that I find endlessly fascinating in that context, and that's the viper F in the writing of Father, where it seems to be some kind of meaning-bearing sign only in that context and nowhere else, as far as we can tell. What is it doing there? It's not representing a viper, but I wonder whether it's doing something similar, and it represents masculinity. And therefore a father is absolutely a masculine thing. And it just borrows that from the fact that we use it so often, or the Egyptians use it so often, to represent he and his, and him in certain contexts. So I wonder if the reed leaf sign can do the same, that it although it's a phonetic sign and we're trained to look at it like that, it doesn't have the same kind of semantic content as some other signs because of that substitution with the human man. I wonder whether it can, in certain contexts, take on that meaning. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember to hear one of the classes by Gérard Roquet saying exactly that F is the F for he. So this is the father is the prototype of he. So this is why F is being used as an ideogram for the word it. It makes sense, of course. It's something speculative if you want, but it makes good sense that you use the viper as a prototype of masculinity, or the typical masculine figure in Egypt is the father. Yeah.
Jorge, I think you.
Yes,
you were first.
a small addition on this one as well, as it was brought up by Angela about the M17, so the reed leaf when it's used as replacement of humanoid figures. This is also what comes back to the presentation of Cesar and Carlos, where you argue that it might stand for Iri or Iri, and there I kind of simply want to say, no, it shouldn't, because in some of the coffins that you mentioned, so the M54C, there all humanoid figures are replaced by the reed leaf, and usually is at one stroke, but it can be either or. So it's sometimes reed leaves Z1 stroke, sometimes only Z1 stroke, sometimes reed leaf, which makes certain parts of the text very intriguing to read until you figure out, oh wait, this can be a classifier. Oh wait, this can be anything in this text. So this is switches around. This is basically the same joke that happens in Der Alberge for the later period coffins, where the man seated on a throne, normally read for shepherds, also becomes usable for the first person pronoun. So there's exchanges happening, but this is one of those cases where, especially for those cases of Osiris, that the reed leaf should be read not more than replacement for humanoid figure, not as any additional feature, in my opinion, at least. There might be cases where I'm wrong, absolutely, but in these cases, at least for some of the coffins, it's structurally that there's no humanoid seated figures in there, and it's always replaced by the reed leaf. So it seems a structural feature based on the scribe, based on the support.
Yeah, thank you very much. Any other thoughts on this particular point? Because then, Julia, I would like to have a question to you and the graffiti. How often, so as you showed examples when there was a name next to an already existing figure. And I was just wondering, are there cases when you could prove that a graffiti is interacting not with the original tomb decoration, but with the already existing other carvings or dipinti or whatever?
So I presented an example. I think I presented an example at Oka and Jaén, but I also can't remember exactly what I presented. I've presented at some point in the last 2 years an example from the tomb of Rewe, which is a fascinating little tomb in the Teddy Pyramid Cemetery. Again, there's so many excellent tombs in that cemetery that just warrant more photography and more like research on them. That tomb has lots of different types of inscriptions, including erasures. Middle Kingdom graffiti, very exceptionally, definitely Middle Kingdom graffiti, because they're Middle Kingdom names that cannot possibly exist before the 11th dynasty. And there's a graffito that sort of, it's one of the rare examples of a graffito scratched and getting towards, and like more fully carved, getting towards that, but still with scratched, a sort of scratched technique that is sort of underneath a chair. It's not attached to a human figure, and that's really quite unusual. And it's unusual to me. I've spent a lot of time looking for these things specifically in tombs. And at least for the Old Kingdom, this is really, really unusual that a graffito doesn't seem to have some sort of, I'm not saying that every single time it has a very serious sort of relationship with the decoration, but that there is some sort of intention, and it could also be about visuality. So not necessarily about like, actually this is being formally integrated, whatever that would mean, into the decoration, but that your eye is drawn to this. It's you know, they're often eye level height. So there's so many things to consider. And this example from Rewe, where it's a graffito of a man named Mentuhotep, that is sort of quite exceptionally just underneath a chair in this big sort of space. So it's prime space for doing something there, and it just happens to be a name, and so that's actually quite unusual. But there are very few for Old Kingdom graffiti. There are very few examples where there sort of seems to be actually. No, I've just thought of an example. I was about to say there's very few examples of where the graffiti is sort of interacting with each other. But I've just remembered that I wrote about this in my PhD, which is 2 years ago now. And in fact, I've argued that in Meruka's complex, there is sort of what Chloe Ragazzoli has described as a sort of a sort of an accumulation of graffiti that makes it a space in which you want to add your name also. So whether or not the graffiti are sort of interacting beyond that, I'm not sure, honestly, but it seems to become permissible or even desirable that you would add your name also to a space that has lots of inscriptions. So we see that a little bit in Meruka's complex around a very highly trafficked doorway. But yeah, there are also many tombs that have no graffiti that we know. These are very, very poorly published. And in fact, one of the things I was doing in Saqqara when I was actually there under a permit was using raking light to also look at undecorated spaces, and there is a huge amount of figural graffiti all over these tombs. So yeah, and some of my work has been to try and sort of bring those realms a little more closely together, because I think they're connected, if not in their content, then definitely by their authors. And yeah, there's just a huge volume. Not possibly one person's project here, but just to say that there's a huge volume of epigraphic activity that I think is missed in our sort of in our publications. And even if you look at like the 3D model of Mehu, for example, that went online, the Ministry of Antiquities put a sort of 3D model of this tomb online a few years ago. I've also worked in that tomb with the Oxford Expedition to Egypt. That is very good, but you still can't see a lot of the graffiti, even in with quite high resolution photographs. So it really does require, in the future, sort of significant new research with you know, better equipment, better tools, better places to store all these images. I mean, there's so many things at play here. So yeah, I hope that sort of rambling answer offers some perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really, really unusual. It's different in the New Kingdom. It's so different. I don't yet have an understanding as to why and when that changes, but there is something different happening in the Old Kingdom, at least in terms of how people are using this medium to express themselves through, you know, through making additions to these terms. I'm not sure I want to give an answer to that question. I'd really prefer to sort of, I'd prefer to actually gather more material first. It seems like there's a real need there. before we start drawing conclusions about intentionality. I just think that there is intentionality and we should take the material more seriously, as Dina has said.
And usually, so how many times do you meet the same name? So, or like same person?
Really tough
Supposedly.
to answer. Yeah, it's really tough to answer that one. It's actually quite unusual in the tombs that I've studied and what's available. It's quite unusual that names are found in multiple tombs. I think that's quite telling. We can talk about telling case studies. I think that's quite telling that it seems to be that there seems to be a relationship, at least between the person making the inscription and that place. Whether or not it's about the tomb owner or whatever, but that they're not just going tomb to tomb to tomb like they do in the New Kingdom. Again, there's something different happening about how people are coming to this space and expressing themselves that is just operating a little differently with the Dipinti. For these Old Kingdom inscriptions, it seems to be more sort of coming to a particular location, and that particular place is the place you put your name. I have suggested that for Ray Ware, we have this Middle Kingdom graffiti, that there could be other explanations. It could be a convenient place to stop and rest in the shade. It's very close to the well, it's all destroyed now, but the causeway for Teti's pyramid, and there would have been other structures to the east that are sort of completely lost now, but it might have been that this was also a convenient place to stop. Not that makes the graffito sort of, any less serious, but just that could be an explanation as to why that place.
Yeah, fascinating topic.
But the builders' inscriptions is where we can actually see people across the plateau, right? I see real potential in this. I do think that we will find examples where maybe not in graffiti, but if we look at multiple inscriptional modes, this is so hard to do, but it is something I'd like to do in the future, is actually looking at the named offering bearers in the Saqqara tombs and finding potential parallels in the graffiti. And I do think it's possible. There are some tombs in the Unas cemetery, for example, that are roughly of that same period, where you have officials working as cult bearers in the Unas cemetery who are buried elsewhere. So I do think but it's hard. And just because, for example, some of the names are so common, right? I mean, anyone named Anku, for example, there's so many of them, or Ihi, or, many of these short, Kurznams, for example, like it's very hard to demonstrate that those graffiti, or a person named in a graffito is actually the same person that's, named in the Unas cemetery in a hieroglyphic inscription. But I think the potential is there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Carlos.
Yes, Julia, I wanted to ask about the beautiful graffito, hieroglyphic graffito, about the burial date of the tomb you showed. Is that do you think, a historical reason, a legal reason to demonstrate that the burial effectively took place, or why is that? What could be that?
What an interesting idea. I hadn't considered it as from a legal perspective, Carlos. It's a really interesting idea. I don't actually have an answer. And I'd need to sort of check what the comparative example on Abu Sir is. There was one that was published more recently, I think, by Hanna Vimatsilova. I looked to my Czech colleagues, they might remember what I'm talking about. But there is another example from Abu Sir, but that's it. I mean, literally there's two. So I mean, it's very difficult to say from that as to why. Suggesting it has a legal reason. So like, this is actually now, this space is a functioning sort of cult place. I don't know. The fact that it had to be finished by multiple other household family members, for example, might have something to do with it, although I'm now sort of clutching at straws. There are many examples, even just in that one cemetery, of tombs changing hands among a family. So it could be connected to that, although, again, it doesn't, the other examples don't have that type of inscription. I think I said earlier, and I just don't have any evidence for it, but I do think that maybe these types of inscriptions might have been more common than what the evidence sort of gives us. I wondered about, for example, a note on a sort of papyrus docket, for example, or a wooden docket being sort of placed on a door. I don't even know if they did that. I mean, just sort of thinking about more ephemeral things that could have also had the same function. So I will think more on the on the potentiality of it having a legal. Does anyone else have any ideas, by the way? I'd be delighted with further solutions, because I really just don't have one. And I think it is connected somehow to the tomb being finished by, multiple family members, but beyond that, I don't really have any more creative solutions. And it doesn't feel very creative.
I was thinking that such information probably was originally documented in some kind of necropolis diaries, so like administrative texts, and then by chance, because like what came to my mind, there are these contracts with priests in the Middle Kingdom, and there are just a few of them recorded on tomb walls or on a stela, but we assume that it was a much more widespread practice, and for one reason or another, for example, Jeff Happy, he decided to let it on his tomb walls. So yeah, it was just like, it's not an answer, it was just rather a thought that I tried to reconstruct the original place of this information, and then I think your idea about like some kind of like more perishable material, like when they sealed the tomb, but maybe they had it usually there, but this time they decided, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but just to pick up, the tombs are not sealed as well, right? So they could actually go in and out. They had doors. So I know what you mean. So like sealed in the sense that the door is closed, but there are also, I mean, this is what I was thinking, more not the tomb was never sealed as such. It was meant to be a space that you went into. And we do know that they had doors, and then there are sort of levels of access even within the one tomb. But yeah, these first rooms seem to be places where more inscriptions occur, which probably isn't that surprising given it's the first place that people enter. It usually had the most natural light. So I dropped from my talk, but I love including these with the Senate boards that we have carved into the tomb floors of many tombs in the Teti Cemetery, and now also recently published in and around the temple spaces in South Saqqara. We know that people were coming into these tombs carving Senate boards in order to sort of play games and use these spaces. They're sort of lived, inhabited spaces, not in the sense of like, living there all the time, but spending time. So it should not be surprising that we have, epigraphic activity in these spaces, and perhaps other things that are lost to us, ephemeral things, as you say. But yeah, and I can't draw a connection so readily to this beautiful painted inscription, but we also have many examples of papyrus documents that are transferred onto a more monumental sort of format on stone, for example, and it produces all sorts of interesting problems in terms of reading, because they don't know how to organize the space on a limestone stela in the same way that they do for papyrus. And I'm thinking of one, I've just forgotten where it's from now, but where you sort of read and you sort of start going around in a spiral, and you can sort of like, you're with the person carving this, you're just like, yeah, we're running out of room now. And this happens a lot with these inscriptions. Even this painted inscription, you might have noticed, I'm sorry, I can't share a picture of it now, where it's beautifully spaced at the start, and then by the time you get to the name, which is arguably the most important part of the inscription, it's like, oh, we've actually hit the boat now, so we're just going to shove the car sign sort of in this upper direction, and then a tiny little seated nobleman, which is possibly one of the most significant signs in that whole inscription. So even in this example of a beautifully painted dipinto, you can see this sort of they haven't quite properly planned, or they've sort of judged, yeah, I've got enough space, and then they start writing and they're like, oh, now I can't actually write over the boat, so I'm just going to start going up this way. So yeah, that didn't answer your question, that was just like an aside.
Yeah, thank you. It is just I am conscious of the time, so York, if you I let you speak, but then we go discuss questions from the chat, because yeah, our time is almost over. So, Jorge.
Yeah, sorry. Just as an interest, I'm not sure if there's anything there at all, but those dating inscriptions, do they also occur in, do they occur more often? They specifically above boats? Is there something there, or is it simply just a random location where they decide to do? Because I've barely looked into this stuff at all, to be honest. I think this was for one of the first times I ever heard of it. So it's just, I'm just instantly wondering if the boat might have something to do with it, with the placement of the text as well, or that was just a useful space.
I think it's a useful space. I did have some crazy wild ideas that I just didn't want to like express, but I'll just express them here now. And you can all think I'm crazy, but and you'll hear the influence of Angela in my excitement around the sort of orientation of seated men, the little seated man signs. I was thinking like the placement is sort of quite special in that the orientation of the seated man sign is that he's sort of seated actually inside the reed boat. But I couldn't commit that to paper, I think, but I'm just going to throw it out there because I like it. But yeah, I don't know if there's a particular, I don't think there's necessarily I don't think it's about the boat. I think it is about that wall being potentially finished by this person Messi. I do think these things are connected somehow. It would be really great to do sort of, I don't know, a type of analysis about the sort of looking at the levels of paint, for example, and I don't know, a person that is clever about those sort of things might be able to sort of draw some conclusions about the palimpsest of paint on that wall would be fascinating. Whether, for example, it's the same type of black, whatever is being used in the ink for the inscription, if it's the same as being used in the background, would be, I think, really fruitful. These are things I'm totally not qualified to do, but I think are interesting questions. Doesn't answer the boat question, just offers more problems, I think. But yeah, I did think about the boat. I really did. It's just there's not enough. I just think there's not enough inscriptions for us to draw a conclusion, but it is interesting, and the boats are significant in the decoration, so it shouldn't be excluded as being meaningful.
Thank you both. So now we have at least one question from the chat. So I don't see it yet, but I will see hopefully. Oh yeah. So if I see, there is, oh yeah, it was still a comment on a discussion we had by Joanna, a certain Joanna. There is a danger that we impose our patterns, systems, and way of understanding the world around on the Egyptian way of thinking. What do you think? So anyone? I think we also a little bit touched upon it, but if somebody would like to make a further comment.
Well, I think Rune told before that this is a classical question. So how far can we arrive with our conclusions on consider that a variation is a mistake, a clear mistake, or something in between, or something creative? I think it's a very healthy question to do every day, and one of the things I think about thinking about this problem, about how sure can we be of our conclusions, or when can we find a pattern and be sure that we have found a pattern, as Lisa was talking about. One of the matter is quantity, I think, and we tend to feel more sure when we go with a lot of materials and saying, okay, this is the same, this is the same, this is the same, I'm in the good track. The problem is always for me when I find something different, where to put it. Sometimes it's very clear, as Jorge said, this is a clear mistake, but other times I'm not that sure. So there is a gray area when you are in doubt, if you are thinking or following properly the scribe, so to say, or you lay straight. Yeah, for me at least, there is I don't know many times, but sometimes I have the doubt if I'm following correctly the original script.
Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts? Because, yeah, Ernesto, oh yeah, that's what I wanted to say, that I understand that you also have two questions. So sorry, I didn't want to.
Yeah, hello to everyone. Yeah, I have two questions, or half a question, half a comment. First is also touching the subject of mistake versus intentionality. Also, where grammar plays a role there. I was working with some pyramid tests from a coffin, and there the coffin is from a woman, but the scribe use masculine pronouns. So also there is the question, you can say, okay, this is a clear mistake, just the scribe was copying the text from another place and he forgot to change the pronouns. But also I started thinking, okay, but maybe he's treating this woman like an Osiris, so maybe you can add the masculine pronouns because of that. So I don't know if someone has some idea where to stand in this kind of mistake or substitution. And after I have a second question, but it's related to the F, so maybe we can leave it for after.
For this one, I do agree that it's a bit problematic to automatically assume that this is an error, that the pronoun is that is not correctly changed. I would agree with that assumption, but you really need to take the full text into regard. And I do notice that for when they're talking about Osiris, a specific, not the god Osiris, but the dead person Osiris, because I think it's worthwhile to make a distinction between the two. Because in certain cases, the text is simply specifying as Osiris and not as referring to the dead person. And with female Osiris are usually perfectly transcribed with 10 after the name. So the understanding, it's clear that at least in most of coffin text I've seen, that the understanding that the owner was female was clear. However, this issue does pop up more often. There is in Courts of Ptolemaic sign list, there's one sign that has been associated that has been given the function as phonogram S, because there's a Ptolemaic text wherein it structurally forgot to change something into female. But in my book, you can see that structurally based on it's set into the male form. But for me, at least, it's clear that this is simply they forgot to change a straight lined sign from one to another, because especially when you're getting in quick script, the two signs of a straight S and the snake will start to look alike a lot. So it's not that weird that you mistake it. And to be honest, write anything down by hand. You will see that there are errors that you do automatically if you like it or not. I would not place this one exactly on the error side of the scale, but I probably, depending on the rest of the text, I will put it close. So if this is in one spell constantly used as the male pronoun, I would say there's more here. If it's the one occasion where the rest is female, then it's an error. That's basically how I would grade this. But I would agree that this one should not be automatically pushed on the maximum side. But especially with these types of forgetting to shift the gender, it is more common than you would like.
Thank you. Yeah, in my case, is in all the spelling, like in all the coffin, it's just F. But the other question I had was, I'm working in a TT49. This is a New Kingdom tomb, and in one occasion we have an F with dots around the head. This is like a very specific variation, and I don't know if someone found it in another text, because it's the only F in all the tomb that is like that. But grammatically, it's just a normal F. You know, I don't remember on top of my head the word that is writing, but is just like a normal F, and we could not find any different use that any other F in the tomb. So that this specific F has all these dots around the head is kind of puzzling. So I don't know if someone has some idea or can share if knows another occasion of this happening.
Maybe you can share with us the work with the hieroglyphs so we can have a look. It will be nice to see it. Yeah.
Oh, sure. I can email it to you. No problem.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think the only thing that I love these little additions to signs. I think the only thing that comes to mind is that you can occasionally get birds and going back into the pyramid text that have little dots around their head for seda, to shake. And at least in that context, it's to do with some kind of shaking. It may, the other thing, while we're all wringing our hands deciding whether something is a mistake or whether something is a meaningful variation, you also probably get occasionally humor, and it could just be somebody thought it was funny to go doop, 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 doop around the snake's head. So there's another color to add to the spectrum.
If you wouldn't push it as far as simply the brush scattered some of the ink around, and they just said, okay, we have to do something with this just to make this look relatively nice. But on the other hand, it might be possible that this is accidentally in connection with WebHash to be bright or something like that, that there is some connection with light or scattering or something that they intended to put some extra detail onto. So this might be meaningful or indeed completely just a joke.
Recognizing humor is not always easy, or that's what we think.
Sadly, I just don't remember the context of where it appears, but I will share for you so you can have a look.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, our time is up now, so I will be the strict chairperson to say that, okay, we are finished for today. But I think, tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, we can continue because maybe there will be new thoughts coming tonight or tomorrow. So thank you for all the speakers for their excellent presentation, and thank you everybody for this discussion. And I hope that you will have a lovely evening and hopefully see you tomorrow.